Today we get the opportunity to meet Dr. Tabia Lee. She's a lifelong educator and one of the members of Free Black Thought. She's actually been a victim of DEI, but not in the way that you may think. So we're going to have a vibrant conversation about the impact of DEI on her life, and I look forward to this, and I hope you do as well.
All right, well, you know I'm a big fan of your work because you came to visit with us, and I got to see you in action. And what I want to do is talk with you, Dr. Lee, about DEI in general. There's some contradictions that have occurred in DEI, and I think a lot of Americans are wondering, aren't we very diverse? Aren't we equitable? Aren't we inclusive? And the interesting thing about your role is you were actually a victim of DEI. And I want you to do me a favor, explain your role at De Anza College, and we're going to delve into that a little bit more. But what was your background into getting to that position, and then explain the role, and then let's go from there to what happened at De Anza that led you to the point where you ended up in a lawsuit.
Yes, so I am a lifelong educator, and I'm just someone who's always been not only a practitioner, but someone who wanted to share how do we better the craft of teaching with other teachers. After I obtained my doctorate in educational leadership and administration, I switched into higher education, and I actually served in multiple private colleges as an adjunct teacher, helping train teachers of English speakers of other languages. And so when I saw this position pop up during the pandemic at De Anza College, it was for the faculty director for the Office of Equity, Social Justice, and Multicultural Education. And I said, I'm gonna try for that, because that's things that I've worked on my whole life, equity, social justice, multicultural education. Those were things that were near and dear to my heart at the time. And so I applied. It was a very rigorous process. I went through multiple interviews. I had to do teaching demonstrations. There was an interview panel with senior leadership and administration. So it was a very rigorous interview and application process. And
how long did it take for them to make a decision?
That was the thing so the last interview that I had was with the president and several members of his cabinet. And at the end of the interview, the president said, "I'm going to have to make a difficult decision." And he said, "But it's going to be what's best for the college." And I said to myself, well, I've been a little too transparent. He's let me down easy, let me know that, I haven't made it through. But then 48 hours after that, I received a call from the dean saying that I was selected. And I was just overjoyed. And I didn't quite know what the president meant when he said that until a few weeks later, when I started to do my needs assessment conversations. So this was during pandemic, and we were all online. I was able to complete over 60 hours of needs assessment conversations with colleagues, senior leadership, faculty. I was trying to determine, what was the history of the office I was stepping into, what were expectations of people, what were some of their aspirations. And early on, there was a small staff in the Office of Equity, and now I'm not a supervisor, I'm just a colleague, a faculty colleague, but one of the two staff members, told me in the needs assessment conversation that they were a finalist for the position. And they explained to me that they had been a student at De Anza, and that they didn't know who I was or where I came from or what my commitment to equity was, but they were furious that I had been selected as an outsider over them.
Sure.
And they assured me that I would have a rough ride ahead of me. And they then delivered on that a couple of weeks later. And as I talked to people, Kevin, what I found from person after person was that the words diversity, equity, and inclusion were being used constantly in the setting, but each person had a different definition and understanding of it. And in fact, one of the senior people who had been at the college for years said, the problem is we're all saying these things and we mean different things, and we need someone to come in and help us think through and talk about this. And we've never done that. We've just been throwing terms around, and our scores in terms of student achievement have flatlined for almost 20 years. So what we're doing isn't working. We need a different approach. And so I said, well, I'm that person to bring a different approach. I'm a dialogue-focused person. So what I did in my early work after doing the needs assessment conversations was I was joining people together in workshops. And these were defining workshops where I would bring us together. We would all sit, we would talk about what's your definition of diversity. I had one on each of them. One was on identity, one was on diversity, one was on equality and equity.
Yeah, there's always that difference between those two.
Which, yes, I discovered, and even me putting equality and equity together, my tenure review committee told me that I was wrong for doing so.
Yeah.
And that they said that equality was a thing of the past, and they don't focus on that. They're fully focused on equity. And I said, well, then tell me what equity is to you, because everyone means something different. To me, it's always just meant fairness. And they wouldn't ever tell me what equity was to me. They just told me to forget about equality. We're past that. They said it didn't work.
Right.
And then they would show me pictures of things like apples dropping from a tree, and they would say equity means everybody gets some of the apples. They showed me pictures of like a playing field with people standing on boxes, and they said that equity means we're leveling the playing field. And I said, how do I apply that to teaching and learning and supporting of faculty, which was what my role was that I was hired to do? How do I transform these pictures that you're showing me into instructional leadership and, how we engage our students? And they could never tell me that, but just not to focus on equality. I was told that these are things that didn't need to be discussed. It should just be known and accepted and unquestioned. And that's where I got into trouble, because I'm someone who, as I mentioned, I'm a product of the California Community College system. Part of the educational master plan, critical thinking is centered in that.
Right.
And so I had learned you question everything and you ask questions and you explore things from an inquiry perspective. And so that's what I was doing in that role. And I was told that by doing that, I was undermining their equity progress, that I was leading people to danger. When I would,
danger.
Yes, to danger. That was an actual statement that was made by my tenure review committee, that I was a dangerous person and leading people to danger by doing that, and undermining the equity progress by doing that. And
well, if you're a danger, I'm glad we're doing this interview inside, because there could be an assassin.
You never know in today's climate in America. Anyone who does push the envelope and encourage people to think for themselves and to look at data is considered a dangerous person.
Unbelievable.
And your life and livelihood could be at risk.
Well, you certainly found that out.
Oh, yes, in very personal ways. The name calling that took place, the intimidation and bullying. I was called a dirty Zionist. I was called a TERF. I was called the wrong kind of black person.
Yeah.
I was called all kinds of names, and I had never encountered teachers who spoke to one another and colleagues in that way. And as that happened to me, I wondered, and I was concerned for the students that are under care of those educators. When that classroom door closes, is that how they treat their students who might have a question about,
Sure.
Something they're teaching? So in terms of getting the definition on paper and finding, gathering people together and synthesizing what they had said and trying to come to a consensus, that was first step. And then the second step was exactly what you mentioned earlier. How do we measure these things? And what I found not only in our California Community College space and other spaces is that these words are being used and thrown around. They're being embedded into policies. And at the same time, there's no way to measure these things. So there's no accountability for it. And that's a great question and concern for me, because especially at our public schools where this work is being done on the public dime, how are we being accountable to the public that we serve? How do we measure and quantify inclusiveness, belonging? How do we quantify diversity even? Equity? First we have to define it, and then how do we measure it? Well, my goal was really to understand on the ground the way people define this and to come to a common understanding. Mm-hmm. And so through the workshops that I was initially doing, bringing people together, having them talk through, the feedback I received from people was, no one has ever done this with us. They've just come to us and said, we're implementing anti-racism, get started, do it, embed it into your teacher evaluations, just get it done. And no one defined for us what is anti-racism. No one defined for us what is equity, what is diversity, what is inclusion to us. And so what I was doing was bringing these various opinions on campus and surfacing them, that there wasn't just one vision. So that was the danger in my work, Kevin, was that I uncovered that there was a lot of confusion, there was a lot of want to come together and talk, and to define and to make it something that was accountable to the public and to each other and to different departments. And we needed to do more defining before we just dove in and said, we're doing anti-racist work, we're doing equity work.
You've got this narrative that's been said about what it should be. You're wanting to let things rise to the surface so you can have a conversation about it. But somebody's saying at the college, we don't want to have the conversation, just go implement.
Right, and implement what was the question.
Okay.
See, so because I'm someone who's very process oriented, and I like things to be very transparent and known to people. And so that's what I was trying to do, was pump the brakes a bit and say, hey, let's bring in all these different perspectives. So people who had never engaged with the Office of Equity started to come to the workshops. And there was a buzz that started. Beyond the small group that had pushed this agenda, the wider college has people who did have questions about it, and they had different definitions and ways. And what I discovered through this work and through this direct experience was that there were different definitions of social justice and what that meant. And one of them was a critical social justice perspective. And this was held by the members of my tenure review committee. It is one that views the world in a oppressor versus oppressed lens. It's one that makes race central to every topic and discussion.
Right.
It says that racism is present everywhere, that it's baked into American society. And I realize we're saying the term social justice, but they were meaning this from a critical theory embedded postmodernist Marxist perspective. And I was coming from a perspective of classical social justice that really centers the individual, that really centers liberal democratic values, and the things that are foundational to our nation. And this was deemed to be in opposition to the aims of a critical social justice perspective.
Well, that's what I remember you talking about, and that's what I so clumsily was trying to get to. Is that that's what got me, was when you defined what we are now seeing that has become pervasive, this what I think is a monstrous implementation of DEI versus what you mentioned as the classical version, which and the first one being built on critical theory, as you mentioned, and then the second being built on how do we take all these elements of what we can all agree probably does already exist in America, but still make it better. And that's what the crux of it was for you. So is this where, obviously this is where you came to blows with the college itself, but expound on those two differences, because I think the audience, and we already know the first one, the one built on critical race theory and critical theory. Expound on the classic one, because I think that's the one that people are needing to learn more about and understand your point of view, because I will tell you, when you mentioned that before and I saw you talk about this, that was the one that I said I would have loved to have been educated. I mean, indirectly I got that education, but I'm saying formally educated on that. And I think that's what's missing in society today, is young kids, especially kids of color, being taught that your diversity, equity, and inclusion does exist to some degree. You may have to find it, and to your point, from an individual basis, define it for yourself and find it for yourself, but it's there.
Yes. Yes, and this is something that I think is so critical for people to understand, because when we talk about DEI in our schools and our houses of worship, in our civic organizations, there is a default perspective, a default ideology that is guiding that. So, and it's important for people to understand that and to understand the alternative. So the default is what myself and other scholars have named critical social justice ideology. And I want to just talk about it just for a moment, because it involves two important components. It involves a critical race ideology and a radical gender identity ideology, and a fusion of those two things. It is rooted in postmodernist and critical theories. And it really does attempt to push every person into a box, into boxes, into race box check boxes, into gender identity check boxes. This is where we see pronouns, so-called pronouns being used with students. And as an English teacher, it's maddening to me, because it's a teaching of improper English usage. Because no one speaks to an individual in third-person pronouns, but yet we're being told to do that. And that's part of this ideology. It's part of the dehumanizing nature of this ideology, of getting people to, it upsets all aspects of natural law, all aspects of liberal democratic values. And by that, I mean things like centering of democracy, centering of equality of rights for women, minorities, LGBT people. These classical liberal values have been pushed aside. They're considered a negative. So this critical social justice ideology approach is very illiberal in nature. It demands absolute fidelity to it. It demands that you view everything through a lens of race. Or
in this case, a bit of sexuality too, right?
Right.
And gender.
And it teaches students as early as kindergarten about cis heteronormativity and other invented concepts and constructs from gender identity ideology. And it really does things that are developmentally inappropriate and uses tools and methodologies like intersectionality, which are inappropriate for use with K through 12 students. And that's what's being pushed in our schools through this social justice education that, again, has been marshaled in, unquestioned, uncriticized. People say, if you're asking questions, then you're a racist. If you're asking questions, then you're a transphobe. So there's a lot of shutdown of people who can't even ask questions because it's such an illiberal approach by its nature. A classical approach, on the other hand, is one that's really looking at America as a place where we center pluralism and where we have out of many one, e pluribus unum, those foundational aspects. How do we create a more perfect union? A classical perspective recognizes the progress that we've made, whereas a critical social justice perspective, it says we've made no progress. We've done nothing. We haven't done enough, and that's why we need to really just dismantle this whole thing and tear it down. That's their heartfelt perspective. We need to dismantle the progress structures, the power structures by any means necessary.
Right. Which to some degree, correct me if I'm wrong, points at the white patriarchy. Because you were, I think, accused of being like white-centric or white nationalist, or I was reading a Newsweek article or something along those lines, and which brings me to the elephant in the room, that here's this black female who's eminently qualified, and you get caught in the DEI loop of sorts, right? I mean, DEI is technically supposed to protect you, of all people. If we're talking about intersectionality, you fit two that I can see right away. Black female. There's probably three others that you could fit if we want to look at it critically, right?
It's a misapplication of even the construct as Crenshaw defined it.
Mm-hmm.
This comes from legal studies. Now it's being used as a tool that's direct to students, and they're told to put themselves in identity check boxes, and that those check boxes fall on a matrix of power and oppression.
Yes.
The enemy is always white people, especially white males who are heterosexual, and we need to do everything to undermine those constructs and to elevate so-called people of color, which is another term I have problems with because, again, that's promoting this idea of a black-white binary. And
thus the smirk when I said people of color.
Yes. It's a problematic term because, again, it's putting us in that black-white binary, which is so central to the critical social justice ideology. It dehumanizes us. It takes away human agency and resilience. And the idea of pluralism is completely moot when we're thinking of, these so-called people of color constantly pushing up against their white oppressors. And so when I discovered that there were these other ways of viewing it, I started to share that with the community, and that labeled me as a danger for saying there's more than one way to look at this, and we need viewpoint diversity even when we're going to talk about it. If we're going to teach the truth, we need to teach the truth about race and ethnicity. And the fact that these are fluid categories that have been established governmentally over history and time, that different groups of people have been classified as white and as non-white and reclassified.
I believe Arab Americans are classified as white. I know that Spaniards are classified as white. And I've even heard that they're classifying some blacks as whites. I think George Hernandez, or the guy that killed Trayvon Martin, became the first white Hispanic at the time because, obviously people didn't know Zimmerman. Mm-hmm. They thought Zimmerman, he was obviously white, but when they saw him, he looked very Hispanic, which brings up a whole other can of worms because, how do I know if someone's Jewish or if they're black or whatever, because we're all an amalgam of a lot of different things.
But and that's something that a critical social justice ideology rejects. And I tell you how I discovered that. Early on at De Anza, when I was first starting, there was a group called the Equity Action Council. And we met weekly for a couple of hours. Not much action came out of it, and I'm an action-oriented person, but as the faculty director for my office, I was mandated to attend. And we would spend time doing meditations, doing things called conocimientos, which are acknowledgments, and a lot of use of Spanish language, even though this is an English language speaking institution, and just a lot of focus on things that weren't really moving the needle. And then we had a community group come in, and they wanted to talk about the status of Jewish students on the campus and great concerns they had. They outlined multiple things that had happened prior to my arrival that had led Jewish students to feel very isolated on the campus, to feel that it was very unfriendly to them. They had student government meetings where students were shouting at Jewish students, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." Now, this is prior to...
I was going to say prior to this whole situation.
Yes, this is in 2021 and 2022, but prior to many of the world events that have taken place that now many people have heard those terms. But the students felt, rightly, that this was a direct threat to their existence and to, their heritage. And there had been leaflets dropped that were anti-Semitic on the campus, and graffiti made during those times. And so they came to the Equity Action Council and they said, "Will you please just do three things? First, you have a page that says, standing against racism. Will you please add on there that you stand against anti-Semitism? Just add a little statement there. We can help you with it. We can give you, part of it." And they said, please don't start the academic calendar on Jewish high holy holidays. Their requests were very easy fixes. These are things that that could be easy to address. Right. So the Equity Action Council decided we're not going to discuss this. And while the people were speaking, some of my office mates were dropping in the chat, here's some resources for you to take a look at. They linked to things like Students for Justice for Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, and other things that were antithetical to what the speakers were speaking about. They weren't speaking about those organizations or even the aims of those organizations. They were talking about the students here on the local scene and what they needed to feel like they were included. And so when we took it back to our to our office meetings with the dean, I said, these are very serious. What are we going to do about these concerns? And I was told we're going to do nothing about them. And I said, well, why? And he said, because Jewish people are white oppressors. And what we're doing in the Office of Equity is we're decentering whiteness. And I said, pardon? I really had never encountered someone who voiced a viewpoint like that to me that was so historically inaccurate. I said, do you understand I asked this question, do you understand the diversity in the Jewish community, that there are many different types of Jewish people? There's Mizrahi Jews, Sephardic, all kinds of different people in the Jewish community. And I said, where are you getting this idea that Jewish people are white oppressors? Where is that coming from? Point me to a resource. And they never could. They just told me that's the way it is. That is how they're classified. So again, it's a lot of this rewriting of history, rewriting of world narratives and social narratives to fit this critical social justice ideology, and sometimes not even with a logical or rational basis for it. And no one could tell me what they meant by that, but I was just told that I was wrong, and I was told that I would not be supported in doing any kind of anti-Semitism education or Jewish inclusion work, and that let me know that we had a great need for it, and there was an urgency because this is my staff and my dean saying these things.
Well, I know it became a controversial thing because in one of the articles that I researched about you before we did the interview, that became one of the hot topics. But let me ask you this from a pure academic pursuit. At this point, are you starting to, because I know a lot of people are starting to push back on colleges and universities and question, is it really worth it? Mm-hmm. This is anti-common sense. Look, I'm not a doctor, Dr. Lee, but I do have enough common sense to know that the outcome of all of this exercise the way that it's currently being done is not going to end well.
Right.
And I think colleges and universities are starting to feel that pushback. But at this point, are you starting to question like the academic system at this point, or you know where we're headed? And I'd be curious to know, where do you feel like we're headed given your current situation? And by the way, I don't want to forget to let you discuss the group that you're referencing based on the lawsuit.
Mm-hmm. Yes, which I'm thankful for. So many different things helped me to understand the perspective. That's what really led me to try to uncover where were these people coming from? What was their worldview? How were they seeing the world? So there was the anti-Semitic aspect of it. There is also an anti-white aspect of it, because in one of the early meetings again, that was where I was targeted by the person who told me I would have a rough road. This is like 3 weeks into my work. And in a meeting, I was sharing a Google Doc. And I was saying, I'm new. We can, I'd asked them, how do you track your notes and your agendas for your meetings? And they said, oh, we don't. We just meet every week. We just chat. We talk about things we're working on. And I was hired to lead a strategic transformation of the school around the topics of equity, social justice, and multicultural education. I was also supposed to promote inclusion. That was one of the early tasks given to me by the dean. And so I needed to be strategic. I can't just meet with people every week and chit chat and talk. And so I started the Google Doc. I said, we can start taking notes about what we do each week. You can tell me about projects you're working on. All of us can edit it. It wasn't like I was the only editor, and I was hoarding power or anything like that. And while I was explaining the Google Doc, a person told me, stop what you're doing right now. And I said, okay. And they said, what you're doing is you're white speaking, you're white splaining, and you're supporting white supremacy. And I froze, because I've never been in a setting where anyone told me, I didn't even know what white speaking and white splaining was. I had never heard those terms, and I had never been told that I was a supporter of white supremacy. It was only weeks after that, Kevin, when I was going to meetings, seeing how the team worked, I saw them put up a slide, and it said white supremacy culture. And it had things like setting an agenda, being on time, being objective, and all of these things. And it clicked in my mind, that's what they meant when this person called me that, and when everyone looked at me disapprovingly, because I was talking about setting agendas, being on time, all the things I had taught my students.
You epitomize white supremacy.
Yes, apparently to them. And I found the citation it was Tima Okun and Jones, and I was able to go read their work and see what they were talking about. So they were basically putting personality characteristics and calling it white supremacy. So this wasn't the white supremacy that I had, real white supremacy that I had actually encountered.
Guys that are carrying,
Yes, in Central California, like KKK members and skinheads,
right.
White nationalists, like that I had actually had personal encounters with, in my younger days. That's not what these people were talking about. They were talking about characteristics of scholars and calling that white supremacy.
Well, not to interrupt you, but just out of curiosity, these people that we're talking about, what are their nationalities?
That's often asked, and I've also been asked their genders. And some of the information is publicly available and on the website, so I encourage people to go research that.
Okay,
but I will tell you that the people that were holding these perspectives not only were, so another term I learned here was BIPOC. Yeah. That means Black, Indigenous, people of color. So some of them were BIPOC. And some of the main offenders were white in their race, and some were male, and some were female, and some were non-binary. So, so there was a mix of people holding these ideologies, and that's what people need to understand. It's not just by the color of someone's skin or their so-called gender identity or sex.
It's the intersectionality, right?
This has pervaded our American educational system. You will find people of all backgrounds, looks, and identities that are saying these kind of things because they have been taught from the time they're in kindergarten all the way up through college that this is the way the world works and that we're all either victims or oppressors. They have been taught that we all have these identity check boxes and we need to identify which ones we fall in early. and we need to atone.
But the more check boxes, the better, right? Because of intersectionality.
According to that, yes.
Yeah,
And that's
according to
why that's one of the most toxic pedagogical tools that needs to be rooted out of schools. There's no basis in educational research about that. These are things that came from activist communities and fringe disciplines like ethnic studies,
Yeah.
women's studies.
Which, by the way, many colleges are starting to get rid of.
They're starting to, but many are not, and it's been rooted in, and many, oftentimes, a lot of your DEI efforts on campuses come from those fringe. That's been mainstreamed now. So what we have is something that started in the '60s on college campuses. This was started by the Third World Liberation Front. It started at that time as a pushing up against the so-called, powers of oppression. Now that has become the dominant group. And they're not reflective enough to realize that they are the dominant structure now. Really, the shoe's on the other foot, if you will. And now we need to readjust for that because we've gone way onto another extreme of the far left on many of our campuses. So to understand where we are now, we have to understand some of the history. And the original roots of these efforts that have now blossomed into DEI really look back, and it's a gift from my home state of California to the nation, as I tell people. Yeah, this is one of the gifts that we've given, the Trojan horse. It came out of this movement called the Third World Liberation Front. And this was a group of student activists at UC Berkeley and San Francisco State University. This is how the ethnic studies program started. And this is how it grew to other campuses. Some of the most violent student protests in American history, so violent that then Governor Reagan had to call out the National Guard to address it. Okay, he was the governor of California at that time. And what resulted from this, the demands of the students, I encourage people to go read them and to see what they stated. They demanded that colleges of ethnic studies be established because they claimed that white people had dominated so long that, quote, people of color, and who they considered people of color were Mexican, Black, Asian, and Native American, only 4 groups. And they said they deserved their own college is set up. Like, so you have a college of letters and science, you have a college of, different academic disciplines. They wanted these racial groups to be established as colleges of study. And so that was their demands. They were successful at San Francisco State. That was where the first College of Ethnic Studies was established. At Berkeley, they established a Department of Ethnic Studies. And after other colleges in the nation saw the success of those violent student protests and their demands and how they occupied the campuses and then were able to be successful and get these colleges established, that's how it spread to the rest of the nation. And they said, oh, we're going to establish a College of Ethnic Studies here. We're going to focus on only 4 groups as though they're the only groups that have been marginalized and oppressed.
Right.
Yes, and that was, so the original aims were, they said we want these colleges to be staffed by Native American, Black,
the 4 groups.
Mexican, the 4 groups only. The colleges' budgets would be controlled by people of those racializations, and all of the studies related to it would focus on those groups. Now, they wanted a whole administration established. When you look at how DEI has rolled out across the nation, it's in the same way.
Boilerplate.
Preferential admissions for students of certain racialized identities, preferential hiring for faculty of certain racialized identities, and then we had added into that queer theory and queer emphasis. So that's how we started to get women's studies, which really wasn't about women's studies, it was more about transgender studies. Sure. And then also that's how we got these other studies like Jewish studies, American studies, and so forth, all of which are anti-Jewish, anti-American, always. Anti-women, right? So it's a lot of the philosophy is very nihilistic in nature. And at first this was a fringe on the campus, but then it became mainstreamed. Then you started opening up your newspaper and seeing terms used like white privilege, like
cisgender,
cis heteropatriarchy. All of these terms that before no one would have known have been centered even through media because the colleges were producing students who have been fully versed in it, and K through 12 also. So you've spent your whole educational career being raised up in an ideology which is unfortunate. And teachers' colleges are teaching the ideology as the only way to teach about race and gender. And it's all been marched through the institutions for decades now. So just in the past 5 years, more of us have become aware of it because it's come more into the open with the protests on the streets and, the things that have happened after after George Floyd and other things. When that was a push that was made by many of the far left extreme activists to get people to act. That trauma that we all witnessed, was seized upon by these activists and used to bully people into acting. Like, you can't just sit anymore. You must act now. We must have a racial equity policy. So this is how many of our colleges and universities, and the failure of leadership that took place, the failure of moral courage, the failure of these educational leaders to push back and say, hey, let's tap the brakes. I know we're all feeling a certain way, but let's make sure that what we're doing aligns with our mission and vision. Let's make sure that it aligns with what our community needs are. None of that happened. They absconded their responsibility and their duty to the citizens of their communities.
Well, there's no question that happened, and I agree it was a lack of leadership, but it was a common, none of this sneaked up on anybody. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was a radical concept that morphed not only from race with the 4 groups, mm-hmm. but it took on gender ideology, it took on sexuality mm-hmm. as well, and to become what it is. But isn't it the snake that's eating its tail? Let's look at the gender thing with women, and now the attack where transsexual men are now being treated as women, mm-hmm. which is just a biological, again, I don't have to have a degree in biology or physiology to know that we're wrong here. So again, how does academia rationalize this and then have the nerve to call this science?
Yes, and that's a big question that I have, and I'm one of the people who does push back and ask people, show me the data. Where is this rooted in best practices for, educational curriculum building or even student support? And the answer is, we just know it's supposed to be that way.
Right.
Like when you push back on, the use of gender pronouns is what I call them. And
people are getting fired for that.
Yes. And that's a way of silencing people and saying, you will do this too, and without question, or you're out too. I was made an example of. You ask questions, you push back, you try to get people to think and talk or identify points of commonality, you'll be gone too. Look at her, she's out. So this is a tactic that's used, the intimidation, the shunning, the stripping of your livelihood, and your ability to be a part of a learning community. That is a tactic that is used by these critical social justice ideologues, and it's an effective tactic until the critical mass that it's reached now, where people are just starting to say, hey, enough is enough.
Well, 2 things come to mind. One is, you're an educator, you get attacked, and you're there to actually impart and do what would be called I forget what we called it, but the scientific process, mm-hmm. right?
That's white supremacist, by the way.
Well, we agree we're both white supremacists.
Scientific method.
It's obvious that we are both white supremacists. I figured that went without saying. But so we've got that. But the part that gets me is, and you said it earlier, if you're a student, it's one thing, faculty's pushing back, and you would think, well, we're among our peers, and I'm considered an expert. Mm-hmm. I'm running, the person that's been put in charge of this, and you get pushed back. What's happening to these kids that can't ask these questions, that their grades and their careers depend on them getting real answers and being able to come out of this stuff? Mm-hmm. I think from my perspective, and I've talked to many of them, they've said, you know what, we just keep our mouths shut. Right. I think there's that, because they do recognize the common sense. But to your point, there's a group of them that become radicalized. And my question to you, I have 2 questions. One, do you think they really believe it? Is it that dyed in the wool? Because I heard Van Jones say, look, you can stay under the protective umbrella of academia all you want, but at some point you're crossing into the real world. You're going to cross that concrete jungle and face the real world, which sadly, the real world has become a lot of what academia has put out there. Mm-hmm. But looking at that pushback, and this is part 2 of the question, and I asked it a little bit earlier, are we getting that sanity back to some degree that people at Goldwater and the audience there and the audience at large in America is starting to go, you know what, I've seen enough?
Yes, but I don't think that is enough. So it's not enough, and this is something, when we're dealing with ideology, so in the early 2000s, I coined the term ideology in practice. And I was really trying to help teachers and educators understand the ideologies that they embody and enact in their practice. And I think until we understand various ideologies and how they work and how they impact people, the way they interact with each other, the way they see the world, the way they see curriculum, until we, as a teacher education training and program, that needs to be completely revised. Because right now, what's being taught to teachers is critical social justice ideology. Yeah. And then they are taking that and thinking, you know, I can't think that everyone's just sinister and trying to destroy things, right? I think that they really think they're going to make a change, a positive change, because that's what they've been taught. This is how you make a positive change. Mm-hmm. And so we need to broaden the lens and get viewpoint diversity in there and tell teachers and assure them and support them that you can focus on equality of opportunity over equality of outcomes. And I don't mean to do a Kamala Harris thing with that. I just realized I was doing that, okay? I'm not meaning to do that, unburdened by what happened. I'm not meaning to do that at this moment.
It was scary.
I know, you're like, wait a minute.
For just a minute, I was going to get out of here.
You know, I'm not meaning to do that, but, you know, this is something that's important. You know, we have made a lot of progress as a nation.
Yes.
But we do have more work that can be done to have greater equality of opportunity.
Okay, so let's stop there for just a second.
Yes.
Because I look at America, you know, a kid growing up in the 60s. I don't look it.
I wasn't born then.
You didn't have to say, I know what you were thinking. But as a kid born in the 60s and going through this sort of really weird transition, because it wasn't this pure, I didn't come of age in the 60s where I understood it. I was just born. Mm-hmm. And but then watching it evolve. And I guess my question is, when we look at this now in its toto, mm-hmm. Where is it going? I mean, if you were to take what you taught mm-hmm. in classic DEI, what you would call, I think you called it classical,
social justice,
social justice, mm-hmm. where would you see things have evolved? And if when people say we've done a lot, but we still need to do more, mm-hmm. you know, it's like saying, well, okay, we overcome slavery, we overcome the women. You know, women mm-hmm. can now do things. Various other people can do things. We view homosexuality differently than we did in the past, and all these different things. And yes, we can always improve. Mm-hmm. But, you know, there's a theory in math. If I keep cutting by half, do I ever reach the point? You know, in other words, if the line is 1 inch away and I get a half an inch away, then I get a half of a half an inch away, a quarter inch, and I get an eighth of an inch. Do I ever reach the line? And the answer is no. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's where we are, where we just keep getting little smaller. Where's a point where we say, okay, how about we just stop talking about it?
Right. And that is something that critical social justice ideologues will resist and fight tooth and nail, because they need race to be centered in everything. Without race, they don't have much to talk about. There's not much under the hood without that construct of race.
So is that why the shift went from race to gender to sexuality and all the other things? Because had we pretty much worn race out at this point?
Not according to critical social justice ideologues. You know,
I know that's always going to be the main one.
They need that. They need that as a construct. They need people to focus on it. They need people to believe in it. They need people to believe that, you know, that there are power structures tied into race, and that, you know, they're inescapable. We can all never overcome. They need the constant, that's called dialectical struggle, the dialect. They need that struggle, that constant conflict, in order for their perspective to work. And what they're aiming for, Kevin, is very concerning, deeply, to me as a former civics educator, because they talk about equality of outcomes. And they mean equality of outcomes in every way, in terms of how wealth is distributed, in terms of how educational attainment looks, in terms of how performance looks. Equality of outcomes among humans who, as we talked about earlier, we're individuals. Each of us has different needs, capacities, interests.
Going to happen.
Exactly. But that is what is being aimed for. And in order to get to that, you have to destroy a democratic republic, and you have to turn that into a communist structure. You have to destroy the governmental structure, the way that people view the world, see the world, or are in the world. to attain critical consciousness, is what they call it in critical theory, which is this idea of constantly viewing each other as victims and oppressors and elevating the oppressed to, to a higher status. Now, to what status? The oppressed take over, and then the former oppressors become the oppressed. See, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Well,
what's
not
being
only
talked
does it
about.
not work in that regard, but apply it to anything. Apply it to basketball.
Right.
I mean, is Muggsy Bogues, who was 5'4", going to become the center for the Lakers,
Right.
and Shaquille O'Neal's going to play guard? I mean, apply it anywhere.
There's just certain variations in human nature, and this goes against that, and it goes against the natural law and the way humanity works, and that's why we have to undermine the family according to this perspective. The nuclear family is directly attacked. How do we do that? We start to confuse people about sex. We start to try to supplant sex with gender, and tell people that they're one and the same, and that you can choose when you simply just cannot choose.
And the concept of mother and father has gone away because
Yes.
what are the new terms for those?
Well, what you want is for people to have loyalty to the communist state. So you don't need the family. Your family is the state and is the big brother who grants you your privileges and your rights and can take them away as needed. That is the whole purpose. So you can't have individuals who are loyal to their families, who are loyal to their churches. We need, if we're trying to advance critical social justice ideology, loyalty to the state, fealty to the state, to what the dictators at the top tell us. And that is how the world should work according to them. And if we could just get everybody marching in line without question, then the goals of critical social justice would have been achieved. And we can get closer to eradicating private property and having state property only.
Boy, now you're talking Goldwater language.
Yes, we can get closer to having everyone on a universal basic income, and
Sure.
and where we're all the same except for an elite at the top. Now, who is the elite at the top?
Yeah.
The Department of Anti-Racism, who decides and tells us, when we're stepping out of line, when we're going too far back, and when we're not using present discrimination as a remedy for past discrimination.
If the system were to stay as it is today, would you recommend sending a child to college? Because it was a big deal for me. I have 3 sons, all magna cum laude graduates of Wharton, SMU, and the University of Texas. And I have a youngster that I'm pretty much saying, you make up your mind, do you want to go? Now, I was from the ilk that you go to college, you get a degree. 2 of my kids have masters.
Yes.
One probably will get his PhD because I was very much that way. I've got 3 degrees. You're going to get your degrees. I'm very ambivalent now. I'm more, you can go learn a lot, get a life experience, learn what you love. Let's get you into school for that, specific to it. I don't want you to waste 70 hours on ethnic studies and women's studies and all that versus 75 hours in your degree plan. It's going to get you out faster. So I'm a little ambivalent, so if it were to stay the same, I'll ask you that way. Real quick answer, would you send your kid to college if it stayed as it is today?
I think we need to stay involved in the structures. I think pulling out and isolating ourselves is exactly what...
What are you pulling out, though, by saying, I've gone through 12 years of indoctrination. I just don't want to finish the 4 where it gets even more crazy. Is that really pulling out?
I think that we can't allow the extremists on the far left or the far right to define our path as individuals or as a nation. I think that those who are reasonable people who can consider facts and logic and data and free thinking should continue to be involved. We must. If you don't, what we've seen, because look what happened in education. Many conservatives just said, it's far left and, the leftists rule in education, so we'll just let them do what they're doing. And they kind of pulled out and they went into corporate and industry. And now look what's happening. Now we're all looking at our schools and going, oh my gosh, what's happening in there? Why did we pull out? We pulled out and we said, just let them have it. And they have it and they're just taking it to the limit. You give a little to an illiberal group of people and they're going to take it a mile. They're going to keep pushing those limits.
But what if we had focused on, when they had auto mechanic shop, and they had things that kids work with their hands.
Yes.
And it was, I mean, I remember ridiculing those guys, almost like, oh, there's the blue collar kids. And these are kids now running successful businesses. I guess my point is, should we put this label on college and education to such a degree that we sort of denigrate people that just want to go out and make a living? So
I think there should be space for all different types of learners and their passions. I don't think we should cede education or higher education to the far left or the far right. I don't think we should cede patriotism to the far left or far right. I think we should all be flying our flags. We should all love America. We should all love the possibilities and potentials that America offers to each of us as individuals. And if that means going to a college, going through an apprenticeship, going through a one-on-one training or whatever it is, that should be accessible to every student that wants to do that.
But you use an interesting concept of seeding college. We would all agree at this point college is run by the left.
Not all colleges, though. There's some emergent colleges coming up.
Overwhelmingly,
and options.
Overwhelmingly,
yes.
We would agree that it's run by the left. Yes or no?
Yes, and that's why we need to stay engaged.
I agree.
Yeah.
So, but here's my point. I never thought of college politically.
Oh.
I always thought you go to college to get educated beyond what your high school, whatever your thing was. I never thought, when I was growing up, I didn't think of college as I'm making a political thing and I'm going to get into. And when I got there and I started looking at the class, I'm like, why am I taking, this studies and this, with my advisor recommending this, and I'm thinking I'm getting degrees in electrical engineering and computer science. And then 20 years later, fast forward, I recognized what was happening.
Yes.
I think that needs to change. But I want to shift gears and end with this. We've seen a system that, in my opinion, impacts blacks and potentially other minorities, but blacks the worst, maybe Hispanics after that, Latinos after that. What are your thoughts on what this education system has done to the black community in particular? Let's just limit ourselves to that, being that we're two, I'm not going to say people of color. Two people of color. I did Joe Biden. People of color. Two black folks sitting here talking. I've got my views on it that are very well published.
Yes.
Don't know if you want to expose yours, but I'm going to ask you, what do you feel like this is? What do you think this has done to blacks? This whole concept of what we just talked about for the past hour or so.
Okay, so first I would say we're two human beings sitting here talking who are racialized as black, and that is an active process.
Okay, I like that.
And so I see in each of us potential that goes beyond the melanin levels in our skin.
We agree.
And I think that that's something important for us to get back to, that we are all humans and Americans first. Regardless of how our skin, the melanin level of our skin, or how we look, or things that have happened in the past history, we're here at this great moment in time, and we each have an individual potential to tap into, and our potential is limitless. That is how I feel. That is what I believe. What is taught to our students is that they are victims. And when you are taught that you are a victim and that you are caught in a system of a web of domination and oppression that you can never escape, think of how demoralizing that is. Think of how it just lets you feel like, your capacities and ability to act and move and have agency in the world is limited, because no matter what you do, you're black at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And in that perspective, that is why I find a critical social justice perspective so odious. It limits our capacity to connect with one another in meaningful ways. In some settings, you will be regarded as an expert because you're a black male and you have certain lived experiences that no one else has. So this idea that, I'm limited by my skin color or by my ancestral heritage, or that you are, is very toxic, and we need to divest ourselves of that and our educational system of that.
But do you believe that it has impacted blacks more than it has others?
I believe that it has had a very negative effect on the so-called target groups. Very negative, and we're seeing it in the achievement outcomes. We're seeing it in the achievement levels of all racialized students. This focus on race, ethnicity, gender identity It's wrong. It's wrong-headed, it's wrong-minded, and it's leading our nation in the wrong direction. And it is having the most devastating effect on students who are told that they are victims and victimized and that they'll always be that way no matter what they do, that their merit doesn't matter. That's a dangerous prospect for all of us, because what we know, and this is coming from a lifelong gifted education teacher, students who are highly talented, if we don't embrace those talents and help them flourish in positive ways that are positively impactful for society, they take their gifts underground and they use them in ways that are toxic.
Yeah.
They use them to protest in the streets instead of to make positive change in their communities. And I don't want to see protesters. I want to see informed, engaged citizens who hold their governments accountable, who know what a democratic republic is and the rights, privileges, and responsibilities that go along with living in one.